Alamdar, I am very glad to have you back on the podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be back, man. It's good to be talking to you again. It's in a different role. It seems like yesterday when I was sitting in the U.S. Attorney's chair and had the privilege of getting to know you and talking about my journey. And so it's nice to be back and to see where, to see where I'm at, to see where I've come. And, what I'm going to do for you, Khurram, if you'll do me the favor of checking in on me every couple of years, is I will go back and listen to these podcasts as my own personal diary. So that's what I'm going to do today. We're going to add to the diary of Alamdar Hamdani, as well as you, Khurram, because, last time we spoke, I think you had one kid and now you have two kids. And I think the last time we spoke, it was just you on your own and now you have a business partner. From what I understand is probably the real reason of your success. So for those who don't know, Khurram, of course, is in business with his wife, which frankly, I think is awesome. And many of us could be so lucky.
We're risking making this episode about me. But yeah, those are extremely kind words. And maybe some of my experience will be relevant to talk about to your growth. There's your kids are I don't know how you think of it. Maybe they're grown, maybe they're just, they're still babies to you, but I'm sure you've heard of this metaphor of thinking of a business like a baby. So like a 1-year-old business is like having a 1-year-old, 2-year-old business like a 2-year-old. So like you are still in your infant days again. And so you're right. I think this would be a great diary because every time I've looked back on a diary of key experiences, I'm surprised by things that were prescient. I'm reminded of things that I couldn't even remember I was thinking about. So I do think this is going to be a really interesting counterpoint to your previous episode because you were so in you were in your senior days of that chapter, and now you're in junior days in the next chapter. It's just what an interesting transition that is. And so I think this will be an interesting snapshot that we can revisit. Yes, I agree, in a couple of years. So let's start talking about what that transition is like, because I think any number of people look at a U.S. attorney returning government thinking, wow, that lawyer's got it made, because they have just the most unbelievable experience and relationships. They know, the DOJ inside and out. Like they're going to crush on private practice. That's playing on easy mode. Tell me what that attitude gets wrong.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, there are some truths to that, right? So when I was at the Department of Justice, I worked in 3 different offices. I worked in the Eastern District of Kentucky, which is a small office in a smaller district. And then I moved to Main Justice, where I spent 5 years chasing Al-Qaeda and terrorists and ISIS in the National Security Division as a trial attorney, working with some of the best federal prosecutors in the country, SDNY, EDNY, SDTX. And then I, became an AUSA in the Southern District of Texas, where I worked in national security and public corruption, and I got to try some very important cases, look at some large investigations. And then I got to be the United States Attorney, and build a new skill set as a leader within the DOJ, and even got to be a part of the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, which was I don't think it's been reconstituted under Trump too, but under Biden and prior administrations, it's 11 U.S. attorneys who are chosen by the AG to meet with him or her every 6 weeks and, be part of the policymaking structure of the DOJ. So describing me as somebody who's had this incredible experience and knows the DOJ inside and out, I think is not a exaggeration, in that all of us former U.S. attorneys, especially ones who've had a long career at DOJ, can attest to that. I can tell you I can tell you and I can describe to you what the DOJ and the halls of DOJ look like and smell like, and what AUSAs fret over, and what FBI agents and ICE agents and HSI agents and CIA, what they all fret over and what they care about. I can tell you about that because I've been there. Now, that doesn't exactly mean I'm going to make $1 million on day one. It doesn't mean I'm going to get all the business on day one. And I knew that, of course, when I left the department. Otherwise, if I did believe that, I'd be in for a really, really big shock. And the important thing is, when firms hire people like me as partners coming in, they understand that as well. They're taking a bet on it. They took a bet. Bracewell takes a bet on me, and for all the other former U.S. attorneys who are out there in private practice, the firms are in essence saying, we believe you can take that skill set, the one I've just described, that experience, the one I've just described, and translate it into business. The best firms, hopefully, are the ones that will say, and we know it's going to take you a little time to get there. And that patience, the patience that's being shown by, for example, Bracewell towards me, is something that is comforting, but only so far, because guys and women like me are driven. As you know, Karim, I'm the son of a cab driver. I'm a migrant. And so the only way you get to, I think, be the U.S. attorney from that background is that you are driven, and you are a hustler, and you don't take what's being given to you for granted. And you are constantly making sure, my mother used to say this. It's probably not a good thing to say to your kids, but it ingrained in me. She's a classic Indian mother. And when me and my sister used to laugh too much, right? Like, let's say we were just laughing our butts off when we were kids. My mother said, if you laugh too much, you're going to cry. What an awful thing to say. Like, if you're so happy, someday you're going to be sad, right? But with that, so there's a little bit of like, and I think maybe it's the migrant attitude as well. It's like, don't count on right now, because tomorrow may bring something bad. So let's prepare for that. And I think that's what I'm constantly doing. I'm like constantly thinking, it's great that I'm being given this runway and this time, but I myself, I'm like, I've got to make sure I get this down. I've got to make sure that I'm able to be a productive member of the firm today, if I can. And so there's a little bit of impatience when you come out, especially for, I think, folks like us.
Can you paint a picture of what it's like to leave the office? So you have one of the most powerful high status roles in law. And then a week, 2 weeks after that, you're no longer in the role. You're doing something completely different. What was the first concrete moment you really felt, okay, I am no longer U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Texas?
So the good thing is, and I'll tell you this, the good thing is, and it's because I have a family that keeps me grounded, a family that does the collective eye roll whenever I mention to people that I'm the son of a cab driver and I grew up in a small 2-bedroom apartment in Euless, Texas. A wife who, I don't think has ever been impressed by anything I've ever accomplished career-wise, and is more impressed by when I remember or when I might, volunteer to clean the house or mow the lawn, so what that means is my identity, for the most part, wasn't wrapped into being the U.S. attorney. My identity wasn't, so did I take pride in being the U.S. attorney? Absolutely. Did my mother take pride? Of course she did. She took my LinkedIn profile picture when I was a U.S. attorney, blew it up, and put it up on the wall for goodness sake. I mean, again, classic, I think, Indian mother kind of thing to do. So that all being said, when November 6th happened, and I don't know if you know what happened on November 6th, but that's when Trump became the president, or at least became the president-elect. I was prepared to leave. At that point, I knew I was going to have to leave. As a political appointee, I serve at the pleasure of the president. And history has told me, especially with Trump, that he will get rid of the U.S. attorneys from prior administrations in a fairly rapid basis, and his right to do. And so I was already preparing for that. So November 6th, I took my office knew this. I told them, I'm going to transition out and I'm going to leave prior to the new administration started. So I was in, but the one thing I didn't do, because I made this promise to my office, I said, I will be your U.S. attorney, and I will believe I'm going to be your U.S. attorney until Election Day, which meant I'm not going to look for a job. I'm not going to have one foot out the door until the election tells me I should. And so because I had done all that, I was prepared on November 6th to transition out. And so I spent the next few months looking for a place to land. And I was blessed to have many opportunities. And as a recruiter, it is often difficult for somebody coming out of government to find a landing spot. It helped that I was the former U.S. attorney. So it's all a long way to say I was prepared for the transition. So when did I really believe that I would no longer be the U.S. attorney? January 20th, right? And I was okay with it because I'd come to terms with it. And so in that regard, that was fine. Now, on January 20th, I also realized I'm now going to have to be in a different mode and now be somebody who is in the private sector. And part of that, of course, is to build a book of business from scratch, and hence the new chapter.
So I think there's two components that I'm interested in. One component is the substantive practice of what changes from transitioning from U.S. attorney to private practice. So I think that's one dimension. The other thing is, what changes when there's a business development aspect to your practice, because obviously there's no business development as U.S. attorney. So I guess we can start with the substantive component. So you've been in private practice before. It's been so that wasn't brand new to you. But now in returning to private practice from government, I'm curious about what has been the difference in how you think through legal issues as a prosecutor, as the prosecutor for a jurisdiction versus private practice. And then in that way, what surprised you? Maybe you had some assumptions for what that substantive difference would be, and then what's surprised you about what's different about the analysis that you go through now? Because you're still the same lawyer, you still got the same acumen, experiences, but something's different. I'm curious about the substantive components of counseling and how that differs from the analysis that goes in when you're a U.S. attorney.
Yeah, so you mentioned it. So I was in private practice before. That's important. But more importantly, I had my own law firm for a few years before. And I took on, and this is how I transitioned, this is why I joined the Department of Justice. I took on some national security cases as the criminal defense lawyer. And I took on a bunch of pro bono civil rights cases post 9/11. That's important because I had already learned that, how to have a client who is a defendant and how to talk to that client and how to understand and appreciate what they were going through. That was important. In fact, it became a very important part of my time as a federal prosecutor because of that experience. Because, for example, I was in a room when I was a very young lawyer, right after 9/11, representing Muslims, South Asians, and Arabs. So let's say a person sitting next to me is a person from Pakistan who is scared, and on the other side are two federal agents. That experience, that empathy that was created from that experience, the curiosity that was part of that as well, really drove me as a prosecutor. So, when I was building national security cases, where many of the folks on the other side were like the people I used to represent, it gave me, it gave me a critical view of how things were being built. I could talk to an agent and have a conversation and explain to them, this is how it's going to happen. This is what it's going to look like on the other side when you do X, Y, Z. So I have that experience, which allowed me in this new role as somebody on the other side. And so how do I think of this? The wonderful thing about being a prosecutor and a defense lawyer, and now being a defense lawyer again, is I have been given the gift of the ability to analyze issues on both sides. For example, if somebody's being accused of wire fraud, what I'm going to do is, of course, talk to the client, understand kind of what happened, understand where the facts are, and I can quickly look at the elements of the crime, because I already know them, and understand, for example, where the holes are in the case. That's important. But I'm able also to counsel the client and go, these may be holes, but here's what I think the prosecutor is going to focus on. And this is what the prosecutor thinks is the strength of his or her case. But I can also tell you, this is what I think they think is the weakness of their case. And so when we go to a jury, this is what's going to look like. And so I can take all of that and say, look, this is, in my opinion, the best way to approach the prosecutor, to say, do you really want to try this case because of this issue? Or we approach the prosecutor and go, we see where you are, and maybe it's our time to plead the case. But because I have an understanding of both sides, I also have an understanding of how the client feels, but also how the prosecutor feels. And so, when I look at an issue now, I do look at it from both sides. When I research it from both sides. When I use AI to kind of walk me through issues and dwindle them down, the great thing is the prompts I give are the prompts of somebody who's been both a criminal defense lawyer and been a prosecutor. And so, and that's the great gift that many of us have had that have been on both sides of the aisle. And so how do I look at a legal issue? I get to look at it from a 360-degree view.
Is there something different about how you approach the substantive aspects of analyzing a case now than you did previously in private practice?
Yes, because I didn't have the view of a prosecutor. So prior to joining the department, I didn't know what a prosecutor goes through and thinks about. And I'll give you a story. So when I interviewed for the job to be the U.S. attorney, one of the people I had to interview was one of the senators. I'm not going to name him. It's too. And the question was, Alamdar Hamdani, board of the ACLU, on the board of the ACLU, civil rights lawyer, prior to joining the government, and then Alamdar Hamdani at that point, a national security prosecutor. And the senator asked me, he said, how have you changed? Like, how have you changed? How are you not just a civil rights prosecutor? And I looked at the senator and I said, the big difference between Alamdar Hamdani sitting in front of you now, a national security prosecutor, as opposed to Alamdar Hamdani, who was just doing civil rights work, is this Alamdar Hamdani has a security clearance. And so I now know what's behind the curtain. I now know, what what the national security picture looks like, as opposed to before joining the government. I kind of, I used to debate the U.S. Attorney's Office, I used to debate the DOJ, but I debated it out of a lack of understanding of what made, for this example, national security tick. So, Khurram, that's how I approach it now. I approach it with the understanding of both a prosecutor and a defense lawyer, whereas before I didn't have that perspective. So if I'm looking at, a crime, I'm now looking at it from both sides of the issue. And so, again, it's a different. It's because of that 17 years I have an additional perspective and an additional view that I wouldn't have had 17 years ago.
Let's add the dimension of business development, because that's the biggest difference between private practice and government practice. So, like, if you add in the component of everything you do, you're here to service a client, but then business development is an essential part of the practice. So
huge.
So how does that change how you approach your work? Like, what the day-to-day, the substantive components of your work, what changes once you add a business development dimension to your practice?
So some things did not change, and you had mentioned earlier that business development isn't in government practice. I will take issue with that, and I'll explain why. But some things do change. All right. So when you're a prosecutor, especially doing national security work, you're doing what I think is probably everything you do is above the fold, which means everything you do is going to appear above the fold of a newspaper if it ever sees the light of day. Incredibly important. Going after ISIS, going after Chinese and Iranian spies, and Russian hackers and Chinese hackers. All that stuff, incredibly important in my view. But the cases just don't fall in your lap. You got to hustle to get them, right? I had to work with agents and build not only, of course, a good body of work, but it meant for me, this is how I approached it. And maybe it's because I had my own law firm. And maybe it's because, since I was 13 years old, selling, newspapers door to door, the hustle has been part of kind of who I am. And I keep mentioning being an immigrant, but I think that is an important part of who I am. It is what drives me. And so that same hustle is, making sure that I can get some of those good cases, making sure that agents understand that if we do good work in the Southern District of Texas, they don't have to go down to the Southern District of New York and have those guys prosecute a case. Or if SDNY and EDNY is wanting to get my case, I'm going to fight my hardest to keep it in the Southern District of Texas. And so, part of it is, oftentimes when I had a national security case, it would get briefed up too quickly to leadership at FBI. And so, it's also part of, working with those agents and working with Main Justice and working with FBI leadership and marketing to them and selling to them why, for example, the case isn't quite ready to be indicted and why we need more evidence. So I would argue to you that kind of hustle, that kind of business development is part of what you do as an AUSA as well. And then as the U.S. attorney, one of the things I did that was unique is I did a lot of social media interaction with the community, not only the legal community, but the community in general. And I did that because I wanted to demystify what we did in the office, but I also wanted to make sure that the community knew to come to the U.S. Attorney's Office. I also wanted to make sure that other parts of the DOJ knew that what we did in the U.S. Attorney's Office was important. So I take all of that now into my business development role in private practice. I'm constantly wanting. So I'm using social media, for example. I'm using those contacts and that network to build my practice. A great example is there are a network of former FBI special agents in charge. There are a network of former, AUSAs and DOJ folks that I rely upon to build that practice. There are a former network of United States attorneys that I got to know over the past couple of years when I was the U.S. attorney that I built a strong relationship to, and that I, kept in contact with to help build my practice. And the same is vice versa from them. So, it is that skill, those skills of not only building a practice, but of leadership that I developed over those years are skills I use now to build a practice. So business development isn't just something that happened on January 20th. It's something that has been learned over, 27 years of practice.
And I hope that would be a theme of today is what are all the pieces of practice and history of you that all align up today? I always think about Steve Martin. He was, he was starting to become, he was kind of in the inflection point of getting really popular. He's on the Johnny Carson show. They cut to commercial break, and Johnny Carson leans over to Steve Martin. Steve Martin had this weird practice where like he had some vaudeville, he had some juggling, some banjo, the comedy. It's just like all these like weird pieces that was like unprecedented. And Johnny Carson leaned over and said, "You'll use everything you ever knew." I might be getting the phrase wrong, but it's just the idea that, all these weird things you've done have all added up to this moment right now. And that's what's going to differentiate you, drive you, make you special, all that. So I'm sure that'll be a running theme about piecing together the pieces that have led to this moment. But so something you said is really interesting about the development of cases. And so there's, one thing is earning the attention of the agents to show them that you are a resource to them, that they can come to you proactively as they're starting to build a case, collect evidence, and so you can help counsel them in an iterative process. That to me, that kind of open door thing reminds me of what it's like to be in-house, where I've never practiced in-house, but my understanding from in-house lawyers is you just want to be an open line of communication so people don't even know that there's legal issues that are arising, because how could they? They're not lawyers. And they come to you with just issues, things they're working on, and then you can be proactive. So it's reminding me of that. But I wonder what analog there is to building a case. You mentioned the concept of, something could be, brought prematurely. Are there any analogs in private practice you've seen so far where that skill set of developing a case, there's some analog for approaching a client to say, I think issues are starting to form for you, but if we act now, the issue will be maybe too minor, too small for them to really care about. But if we collect some more information, I think there's an analogous trade-off. My guess is when you're developing a case as a prosecutor, there's a trade-off that just that you can lose opportunity to prosecute something. Maybe it's better to lock in, some more minor infraction versus something more substantive. Maybe by way of analogy, in private practice, there's, hey, maybe we do something to service this client, even if we think we're on the verge of developing something more deeper, more useful. Is there some analogy there? This is something that isn't ringing a bell for me, but I'm curious if you're seeing some connection or pattern there.
Yeah, there is. And what I'll do is refer to kind of constant calculus that's being analyzed by in-house counsel as it relates to the Department of Justice. So I'll give you this example. And that is the issue of voluntary self-disclosure. Do you disclose to the government if you find some wrongdoing within the organization? And that discussion, that calculus, is one that in-house counsel, with good outside counsel who have been and understand DOJ, can make. And so and I'll give you a great, it's for example, if a company discovers that, they have, and we'll use the most recent example that this administration is focused on, which is the prosecution of cartels. And the reason companies are now concerned about this because cartels have now been designated as foreign terrorist organizations. What that means is to build a case against a cartel in the old days required having some sort of drug nexus, right? I.e., the company was involved in drug trafficking. That doesn't normally happen. The companies all the time in Mexico are hiring, let's say, security companies to provide security. If that security company is owned by the cartels or is affiliated with the cartels, now the company that's hired the security firm can be accused of providing material support to terrorism, which can lead to 10x, 100x fines for a company or the amount of revenues it has in a particular year. And so if I'm a company and I discover, for example, that I've got a third-party contractor that, may have a connection with cartel, I'm going to ask myself, do I self-disclose? And if I self-disclose to the Department of Justice, what does that mean? The Department of Justice may give me credit. The Department of Justice will certainly ask me questions. And now the Department of Justice may probe into my company. What does that mean? Right? What else will they find if they do that? Will I get what you call a declination, i.e. the department will say, thank you for cooperating with us. We're going to decline to prosecute. Or will it lead to some sort of, admission of guilt? And what does that mean? And so, that's a situation where I could see companies right now really trying to decide whether or not, akin to agents, whether or not it's ready, whether or not that case was ready for indictment, whether or not this issue is ready to present to the Department of Justice. And so, all of that, the great thing about being in this role as a counselor to clients, we talk about artificial intelligence. And I think there is a lot where artificial intelligence can really replace the rote work of some rote legal. But artificial intelligence can't replace the human relationships and the human connections that former DOJers have created. Artificial intelligence can't take away the judgment of somebody like us when counseling clients on issues that could have hundreds of millions of dollars of ramifications. And frankly, artificial intelligence can't take away the ability to say, now is not the time. Let's wait. Let's do some more investigation, and then let's reassess this. Understanding there's a clicking clock. And so what that means is once a subpoena hits a company, then for all intents and purposes, it may be too late to come forward and self-disclose. And so there is that ticking clock of, okay, when do we make the disclosure? Hopefully that gives you an idea of kind of all the different issues at stake. But, it's a skill that was born from talking to agents and going, when are we ready?
You probably had some ideas in the office about the ways your skills will be useful in private practice. And now that you're, let's say, a year out or so, a little more than that, maybe you have some change opinions from experience about the ways in which your experience are most useful. For myself, let's say, I practice as a patent litigator, and so certainly a lot of the substantive components of a practice are useful. But I think what I find more useful is the structure to a rationale, how I commute that to both law firms and lawyers in transactions. That my approach uses written communication effectively as well, and so that's something that was not obvious to me that would be what I think my naive theory was. Well, it's a substantive component, which for sure is very important, but kind of priced in. What it was underpriced was the techniques you learn as litigator for structuring arguments and advancing positions. And so I wonder for you, what were the things you expected that would be helpful to clients, and what has been unexpected that has turned out to be really helpful to clients?
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm just writing this down so I don't lose my um, train of thought. So let me kind of go back and talk about what I use to counsel, how I counsel. My Alamdar Hamdani's way of counseling, as opposed to others, and others have effective ways that they do it. But this is how I was raised, and it's going to go back to kind of what I observed growing up. So I've talked about my father being a cab driver, and I think, and so part of that is, as a kid, my father sometimes would let me sit in the well of the cab, and I would watch him do his thing. I'd watch him pick up passengers in England, and the one thing, a few things I learned about my father is he would pick up a passenger, and this was his career. He really believed that he was providing a service as a cab driver. He had a black cab. And in England back in those days, having a black cab was really just a badge of honor. Because to get the black cab,
You had to memorize all the routes.
Memorize all the streets, right? You had to pass these tests. And so my father was really proud of his black cab. And, we didn't have a car. It was just the black cab. So the black cab stood outside of our semi-detached house in England, and he loved showing it off to the world. So I watched my father, ply his trade, do his career from the well of the passenger compartment. There was no seat. So I'd hide there and I'd watch my father. And here's what I watched my father do. My father would pick up a passenger, take him from point A to point B. But more importantly, my father would learn why somebody went from point A to point B, because my father was a chatty Catholic. And he talked in this wonderful Indian accent laced with British. And, he really tried to really accentuate the British part of his accent. And he'd really make them feel comfortable. And and they would tell them why they would tell my father, a stranger, a skinny brown stranger, about why they went from point A to point B, why they were going there, what was going on in their world. And it was just amazing to be a part of that, listen to it. And I still remember to this day. So that was, it was a skill that I've talked about. It was a skill born from empathy. A skill born from empathy and curiosity, and grounded in service to that person, and with patience, because he listened. And then he would try to tell some joke in a British Indian accent and make them laugh. And to this day, I tell the best dad jokes to anybody who will listen. But okay, so so one of the things I have done throughout my career is use those skills. And so what's been expected, what I've done is I have taken that, and so with clients, I am somebody who is, first of all, empathetic. I really want to know what happened, right? Just because the prosecutor has accused a client of something, or just because it looks like the client may have committed wire fraud, or the company may have done something bad. I'm empathetic. I want to listen. I'm curious, and so I've got to keep an open mind. Just as I was as a prosecutor, I do now as a partner in a law firm. And and then at the end of the day, I'm going to give you advice based upon my service to you. And I'm going to be patient in how I give that advice, how I develop that advice. It's going to take me time. I'm not just going to give you an answer immediately. I'm going to want to listen first. And so, what that means is our calls are going to be long initially because I want to know, what's going on. That's how I approach things. And so, what's been unexpected from that, I think for me, is clients have, I think, responded well to that. And I think they will give me information and we will learn from each other. And I think, hopefully, it's created, I think, a very good attorney-client relationship, one built from trust, one built from understanding, both ways. And so, it's all born out from how I do apply my trick, how I do what I do. And I don't think it works for everybody. It works for me. It works, I think others may be more, strident in how they talk to clients, maybe be more, let's cut to the chase. I'm not that guy. I want to kind of understand something before I give you my advice.
In thinking about building your practice, how did you think about, a lot of what you're talking about are, in the context of enforcement, white collar. And so I think we're making a tacit assumption about the mix of work, but maybe you can talk about the mix of work that you've contemplated for yourself. Like there's multiple routes you can go. It could be civil litigation, criminal, it could be white collar work. So can you talk about the pros and cons of a practice driven by one of these practice areas, and then how you're thinking about the mixture of work that you're pursuing?
Yeah. Because I did commercial litigation before I joined the department, I am comfortable doing both civil and criminal litigation. Because I ran one of the largest civil divisions of a U.S. Attorney's Office, I'm also comfortable doing civil work as it relates to DOJ enforcement, as opposed to only doing white-collar criminal work. I can understand and talk about both. And so I am trying to develop all parts of my practice. I think what's important, though, what makes my approach unique is that my network is both consistent of both former DOJ attorneys, former U.S. attorneys, and folks I knew when I was doing civil work before joining the department, from law school and from in private practice. But also, I think what's important, what's also been a big part of my practice is the network I created to become the U.S. attorney. So that network was was a big brown South Asian network. And that network, the one thing about, for me, is when I reach out to a former U.S. attorney, former DOJ attorney, or a South Asian attorney, I'll often get back a phone call, which is not always the case now that I'm in this world. I do miss when I was a U.S. attorney, folks would always return my phone call. That's not always the case, and you've got to get over that. And it is often a hit to your ego when people don't return your phone call. Which is, by the way, I will always return somebody else's phone call. I'll do it. If somebody even cold calls me, I will listen, and I will be respectful because it happened also when I was in AUSA. I'll give you a great example. When I was a trial lawyer at the Department of Justice, I had to work with AUSAs in other offices. And, for the most part, AUSAs in other offices would work well. But there were a few AUSAs who were like, I don't know why you're here. I don't need you. And they would treat me like crap. I never forgot that. And which is why when I was the U.S. attorney, I always told that my AUSAs, you will treat DOJ lawyers with the utmost respect, like they're part of your team, even if you don't want them there, just because I knew how it felt. Same thing now. You know, if somebody calls me and says they'd like to meet their vendor, I'm not gonna ignore their phone calls. I'm not gonna be a jerk, and I won't meet with them. And so anyway, and so you know, it's and so now you know, I will make sure I return those phone calls, make sure I'll reach out to others. But yeah, I think I got lost a little bit. But anyway, that's good talking. But anyway, that's you know, my approach, my practice I want to build is in all those fronts. And it's going to require all those different networks to build.
Tell me about it. So in doing that, you could be saying, "Hey, I'm going to niche really hard right now out of the gate." I imagine it's prudent because it's early days still for you. That I want to test different things and see what works.
Yeah.
But can you talk me through pros and cons of niching on one of these practices, or not even of niching, of just pros and cons of these different practice areas as far as building a book of business?
Yeah. I mean, so niching, which means I guess kind of really defining my practice or really kind of focusing it on a particular area is good. So, for me right now, it's government enforcement and investigations. That's where my real sweet spot is. I'm both the civil and criminal world. I can certainly straddle both of those. And so the benefit of that, right? The reason you do that is you can, by focusing on that area, the market knows what you're really good at. In the same vein, I'm building a practice from scratch. And so I've got to be willing to do and be willing to use my skill sets from my prior life as a commercial litigator to do that work as well. And, I've brought in a couple of commercial litigation matters that draw upon that experience. But I'll give you a great example. I think I brought in a commercial litigation practice that required some advocacy in front of a public entity. And that kind of brought both skills to bear. Or I brought in a commercial litigation practice where the Fifth Amendment issues were at stake for a client. And so I can bring in both an understanding of how the deposition, for example, in this case will flow, as well as an understanding of, what the Fifth Amendment concerns are on the criminal side for the client. And so I can marry both of those worlds together. But my sweet spot are really, is the 17 years of work I did as a trial. One of the things I bring that other maybe commercial litigators don't always have the ability to do is I've tried cases, tried a bunch of them. I've also given speeches in front of massive crowds as the U.S. attorney. I've also given press conferences as the U.S. attorney. Those are skills that are transferable to other parts of my practice now. It's a skill, that I feel comfortable, for example, understanding both the press issues as well as the legal issues for a client, because I was in there. I understand, for example, what makes a U.S. attorney tick. And part of that, what the U.S. attorney thinks about when he or she is thinking about press strategy for their office. I know because I was there. And so, all these different things, are kind of where I believe my sweet spot lies. And so it's a long way for me to say, Khurram, I think my sweet spot is still pretty broad. And as the years go on, I'm sure I'm going to develop cases and develop more of an expertise. For example, taking my national security experience and looking at sanctions issues and cartel issues, I can talk about those as a second language pretty well. There are maybe other issues that I'm still developing that I need to learn, but right now I've got to kind of keep all those options open, and which is kind of fun. Every day I wake up and I'm not bored with what I'm doing. It is, I look at, for example, great example. I will look at the Twitter or X accounts of people like, Hermit Dillon, who's the AAG over civil rights, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. And she is, she's putting out content, which makes me constantly think about, okay, how is this going to affect my client, which is incredibly fascinating. And she'll put out content that relates to issues that I don't know about that I'm going to learn real quick so I can advise clients who might be in that space. And the reason I do that is because not only, of course, is Hermit Dillon the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, but Hermit Dillon is somebody I know. Hermit Dillon is somebody I've known for a while. And so, that's somebody who I'm interested in, who I know is sometimes at the forefront of issues that this administration cares about. And that is going to be something that my clients will care about. And so, looking at, for example, the social media accounts of DOJ officials, I think, or those that this administration cares about, is something I'm looking at and really trying to develop as new skills in my practice as well.
This is, I think, a great way to transition. I think I want to pick up maybe later. Maybe we'll cover it through answering this question. Is the pros and cons about having commercial litigation practice, having a criminal practice. Like any different practice areas have pros and cons to a book of business in that space. So definitely pick up on that. But since you're mentioning social media and tracking that, I think some of the things you told me about how you're starting to see around the corner and start to do predictive analysis, because some things you talked, I definitely want to spend more time talking about, I understand the incentives of U.S. attorney. I understand press, how they use press. That's all stuff I want to pick up too. But, I'm really interested in the predictive aspect right now, a predictive counseling, business development, where you are starting to mine different types of data, different types of insights that probably other people wouldn't have a clue would be relevant. I wouldn't have a clue that, reading between the lines of what, an AAG is saying is an insight to enforcement policies that are about to happen. But can you talk to us about some of that predictive counseling? Because I think that is, it sounds incredibly creative and novel to me for sure.
Yeah, so, looking, helping a client see around the corner is really a big part of, if you were to ask me what at the end of the day is my goal as a government investigations partner in a law firm, and that is to help a client look around the corner by leveraging all of my skills, first of all. So leveraging my entire career and using that to help a client look around the corner. But it's not only that. It's, you call it predictive analysis. I think that's a good way to look at it. It's taking the different data points that are out there. And the one thing about this administration, whether you agree with it or not, is it is incredibly transparent about what it's going to do. A great example is you can take an executive order the president has signed and pretty much understand that within a pretty short order, because of the way this administration is set up as it relates to the White House and the DOJ, that executive order will probably become DOJ policy pretty quickly. Unlike other administrations, where DOJ policy sometimes took months, if not years, to develop, and it may have been influenced by what the White House is interested in, but it may also be, carved and put together by committees and subcommittees and, all these other things. That's not the case now. And so, first of all, it's understanding that. So if to those who are listening who are, wanting to know what's the next DOJ thing that's going to happen, what is the president interested in? Look at what the executive orders are that the president's instituting. And that's number one. That's your first data point. The second data point is, looking at what the DOJ is saying. Again, they're very transparent about what they say. A great example is social media. They are all pretty, they are on social media quite a bit, especially the leadership. Whether it's Todd Blanche, before that Pam Bondi, whether it's AAGs of the criminal division, the civil division, the civil rights division, all of them in varying degrees are active on different social media platforms, X being one of them, LinkedIn being another one. And so look at those social media platforms. Look at what they're highlighting. Look at what the U.S. Attorney's Office is highlighting from its social media perspective. And I did it when I was the U.S. Attorney. I would talk about cases that were important to me. It's important to me, and it's probably going to be important to the office, or it's probably going to be important to the leadership at DOJ. And so look at that as well. That's a different data point I'm looking. Policies are coming out every day from this department about what it's interested in, fraud, cartels, whatever, and look at those policies. Review those policies. Add that to your data points as well. Look at what's being charged out of the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of New York, for example. On the fraud side, understand that's going to be a priority of the department, as well as, here in the Southern District. And you look at all of that as well. And so I'm trying to take all of that and help a client look around the corner to make that analysis of whether, how do you approach, in this case, the Department of Justice? Or how do you approach HSI or ICE? Another great example that I'm looking at is, the Southern District of Texas along the border had the most prosecutions than any other district. A lot of that was driven by immigration. So I understand what HSI and ICE care about as the U.S. Attorney, and so as a former U.S. Attorney. And so I take that to bear now. Right? You're going to see an increase in enforcement by HSI and ICE. And what does that mean for businesses? What does that mean for businesses, that do business in the Southern District of Texas, where you've got one of the largest, offices for DHS and HSI and ICE? Who are they focused on? And how does that translate to your business? So all those things I'm constantly looking at, or new issues popping up, in the world of civil rights and in the world of education, in the world of higher education, in the world of oil and gas, which are all priorities of this department. How do you take all of that and tell the client what's coming down the road? And so not only am I doing, of course, a lot of especially former DOJers are doing that right now. They're constantly doing predictive analysis and trying to tell clients either in private or, through client alerts about what's going to happen next.
Can you give me some sense of how you use those insights? Like, how exactly are you communicating with clients, establish a connection either with people that you know, people that you're getting to know? Like, what exactly does it look like? What's the work product, and what's the cadence of how you're building that relationship and sharing the insights? So they're starting to say, okay, Alamdar is really counseling me on what's coming, and it's validated. I'm starting to see the validity in this and understand this. And like, what is that process of actually communicating and getting these insights over to the clients?
Yeah, first of all, it means you getting smart. It means me getting smart on the issue. And that's going to be anywhere from my own experience, right? And then and really going back and looking at the issues I worked on when I was at the department, and kind of those. Or if it's a new issue, certainly researching it, understanding it all around, talking to experts within my firm about it. One of the things that I think I don't have to do is be an expert on everything. And so it's really tapping into the expertise within, in this case, Bracewell, to understand an issue. And say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. What do you think about this? And stress testing before I even approach a client or potential client. That's important. Because one thing you don't want to do is approach a potential client with a half-baked idea. That's not going to get you anywhere. And that could even backfire. It will backfire. And so, first of all, it's doing all of that. And then it is approaching the potential client with, look, this is what I'm seeing. I want you to know about it. But first it's like having that initial phone call. So I'm not going to do a massive write-up. I'm going to say, look, this is what I'm seeing. This is kind of what I think. Let's talk about it. And then we'll have that discussion. And so then having that discussion, you've got to be ready for that. You've got to, know the issue pretty well. Because my guess is you're talking to a potential client who's already an expert on the issue. In-house counsel at an oil and gas firm is going to know oil and gas issues better than you will. And so it's important that when you talk to them, you're pretty smart on the issue itself. But, one thing the in-house counsel doesn't know, for the most part, is what's going on at DOJ and what you think about DOJ and what you think about whatever enforcement arm is doing. And that's what you bring to the conversation, is that additional insight. And then taking all of that and go, this is what I think is going to come around the corner. Now, it may or may not come around the corner, but what I've now given my client or potential client is something new to think about, something new to talk to, let's say, the C-suite about that they may be interested in, or something to talk to, assume you've got a compliance team, to really bring up with the compliance team and go, have you thought about this? And if they haven't, that's a value add that you've given. But being, the business development aspect of what I am doing right now is constantly thinking about these issues and bringing them up to potential clients or clients. And so but that's what it takes to get there. So it's not just, seeing something on Twitter and making a phone call. That would be a bad thing to do. It's about seeing something on Twitter, thinking about it, reaching out to people within the firm, doing research. I do a lot of AI research. AI has become incredibly powerful as a tool. And I don't have the time to, just, do a bunch of Google searches. I've got really powerful AI tools within the firm that I am using constantly to both refine my idea, but also refine how I speak about that idea. That is important as well. And taking what I know and really refining that as well. So I will take, for example, let's say there's an issue. I will take memos I've written, speeches I've given, and things I've done, and put it as part of what the AI tool will look at. And of course, they will look at what I've done within the firm itself, and so I can really be smart about what I talk about. And so anyway, that's kind of how I approach it.
So you part of what you're talking about is packaging things to help your counterparts look smart with the team they roll up to. So they, the C-suite. So you're arming them with tools that they can approach the C-suite, and then they can show up and say, hey, I'm being proactive here. And that's going to make that lawyer look good, and also inform the C-suite about something that they just didn't have on their radar.
Yeah.
And so I wonder how much you mentioned the incentive structure of the U.S. Attorney's Office. More broadly, your earlier point was really helpful about the analogs business development in client development in the U.S. attorney's role. There's more similarities than you might realize. And so I wonder if in the same way, are there, in thinking about the incentives of a U.S. attorney, this sort of executive of this organization, how well do you think that maps onto a CEO in terms of thinking about incentives, priorities? Like, how are you taking those skills, understanding here's the incentives this person faces, and here's how to make something persuasive to that ultimately moves the needle for that person? How is your counsel? How are you thinking in similar ways about how your counseling is ultimately beneficial to a board, the CEO? And are there is there something about the incentives that map on or not? Maybe they're completely different.
So, I've never, of course, been a CEO, but I have led an organization of 400 employees and 200 federal prosecutors. I've led an organization where I am answerable to a deputy attorney general and the attorney general on a semi-regular basis. And so, leading an organization, and one of the things when you lead that organization, when you're answerable to the DAG and the AG, the one thing that that you learn as an AUSA, but you really have to use as the U.S. attorney, and that is the ability to both report up and predict. And so I was constantly doing that as the U.S. attorney. I'm constantly, as it relates to the AG and the DAG, was, reporting up, let's say a massive issue that I think is happening in the Southern District of Texas, or report up a big case. And then I'm giving them, this is what I think is going to happen as a result of that, or as a result of these issues. And so, I take that same view as to the role of in-house counsel or general counsel. But their job is to protect the company, just as it is the C-suites. Their job is to protect the interests of shareholders. And they do that by reporting up to the C-suite, just as they have people reporting up to them. And just to have people reporting up to them, if they've done it right, as I did, they're reporting up to you and predicting what's going to happen. They are also reporting up and predicting what's going to happen. It's the same skill set that I'm using when counseling clients. I'm reporting up to them, what's happening and predicting what's going to happen as a result of what I'm reporting up. And, you don't have to be the U.S. attorney. You don't have to be a CEO or a CLO to understand that skill. And it's a skill, that I think even young associates are doing. Young associates at law firms, they are constantly reporting up to their partners if they're doing it right. And, when they report up, they don't just report up, they report up and going, this is what I think is going to happen. If they really want to be a value add to the partner. And so it's a skill that hopefully is being learned, when they're a summer associate or when they're a young associate. It's a skill I know I learned when I was a young associate at a large firm here in town. And so it's so that's, if I were to kind of whittle it down, that's kind of what I'm doing. And it's what we're all doing at either smaller levels or much more impactful levels.
Is there a piece of work product you're most proud of? And obviously, you don't have to share the substance of it, but just is there something you could share about something that you're most proud of? Maybe some original analysis. What is it that has gotten you so excited in say the past 6 months that you've done?
Yeah. It was from reading what was happening, and so Trump had issued an executive order on day one as it related to issues relating to diversity, equity, and inclusion, which was a sea change from how the Biden administration did it. As a result of that, I understood that things would change in that realm not only for companies in general about using DEI in the workplace, but how this administration would take that issue and use it within its enforcement structure, i.e., would the DOJ take that particular statement in an EO, right, and use it to like enforce the behavior of private companies or public institutions? And I figured it would. And I reached out to a public institution and said, I think this is going to happen. And because of that, and it did, and because of that, I was able to help that institution kind of get ahead of the curve a little bit and really anticipate what was going to happen. And look, that's just one issue. DEI, means, DEI and that issue of DEI, according to this administration, they look at the case called SFFA versus Harvard, and they've extrapolated that case to mean, for example, companies that receive federal funds, right, cannot, have certain policies in place that would discriminate against not only African Americans but all races. And so, having a DEI policy, according to this organization, according to this administration, would be in violation of the Supreme Court case called SFFA versus Harvard. And if you receive federal funds, let's say you're a federal contractor, what that means is you are now subject to this administration's interpretation of that Supreme Court case. And that has led to an enforcement mechanism by this DOJ that wasn't there before. That wasn't part of the Biden administration, nor the Trump 1 administration when it came to enforcement. It's a whole new enforcement mechanism that this administration is focused on. Again, rightfully or wrongfully, whatever you believe about it. But I think one thing that I saw coming down the pike that maybe others did beforehand. And I think that's important.
What is if you had to point to one persistent misunderstanding that the private bar has about how enforcement attention forms, what would you say?
About what again?
One persistent misunderstanding, misperception that the private bar has about how enforcement attention forms.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So enforcement, let's just take it this. Let's take it down to this. Why does an AUSA walk into a grand jury room and seek an indictment? That is the ultimate form of enforcement. Oftentimes, they will think it's because an AUSA is driven by what, the president has said, or what is out there in the political atmosphere or the political ether. And I would say for the most part, that's not the case. AUSAs are driven by the facts and the law. They're driven by what an agent has put in front of them based upon an investigation. And, and so AUSAs, for the most part, do a good job of ignoring the noise of Washington, D.C., and do focus on kind of whether or not their case follows the facts and the law, whether or not the case is one that deserves a federal attention as opposed to maybe going to the state. And so, oftentimes private firm attorneys or even just people in general will believe a prosecution is brought because of the political proclivities of a particular AUSA. And that's not the case. I can tell you as the U.S. attorney, I didn't know what the political leanings were of the people I led, nor did I care. People knew I was nominated by a Democratic president, But even then, I don't think people knew, maybe where I aligned on the political spectrum, and I think that was important. And so, I think I think that's probably a big misconception that people have now. Whether this administration changes that perception, I'll leave that for other people to kind of predict and talk about. But I would say, as a general matter, AUSAs are apolitical animals, and oftentimes people don't appreciate that.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to, you talked about phone calls not always getting returned, and that's a big change for you as from the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I think that is something that's not intuitive at all about a transition to private practice. Is, you would expect some degree of that status authority porting over, and that's just not always the case. You're just no longer in that office, and so just something drops off. So what has this chapter taught you about resilience, setback, rejection? Tell me about that, because I think that would probably be pretty different. Of course, as a U.S. attorney, you can lose cases and experience setbacks, and maybe the administration directs priorities. So it's not that you're immune to it, but it seems like a big change. So, but what is this? In building this book of business, in making a name for yourself right now, differentiating yourself, like what are you learning about rejection?
Yeah. So, I think, let me go back to, what I talked about earlier, as far as like my father and leadership, and kind of things I learned by watching. So I learned about empathy. I learned about curiosity. I learned about service. I learned about patience with his passengers and the people he would bring. But I also learned from my father, a man who, had to raise a family, work two jobs, despite working two jobs, despite moving twice, once to England, then to America. Couldn't get past, having to live paycheck to paycheck. Couldn't get past, for a long time, living in an apartment. He finally was able to buy a house, living in an apartment. Understood that, he couldn't pay for college. And I'll never forget when he had to pay his mosque dues, whatever they were, because in my mom and dad had to pay dues every month to the mosque. He couldn't afford it. But I learned from my father. But I learned as a kid who grew up in that, is you learn humility. Like you are humble often. And so when I used to sell newspapers door to door at 13 years old, I spoke with a British accent. I spoke too fast. And I got rejected a lot. And I learned to be humble. I learned to eat that. I learned that I wasn't going to make much money. And then I sold, after that, in college. I used to sell over the summer. I had a summer job where I sold New York telephone subscriptions and Sesame Street books over the telephone. Got rejected all the time. I was a telephone salesman. And that will teach you humility. And so, and along the way, of course, I've learned to be humble. And so, when you call somebody and don't return your phone call, it doesn't mean it doesn't sting, because you know humility, but it reminds you of your humility. And I think one of the most important things I hopefully did as a leader when I led the Southern District of Texas is I was humble by my mistakes, and I made a lot of mistakes as the U.S. attorney. And I remember once I sat down a couple of AUSAs, and I apologized to them for an action I had taken, not expecting them to. I don't care for them to accept my apology. One of the things about apologizing, by the way, is when you apologize, if you truly apologize, it's not about them accepting your apology. It's about them understanding that you have apologized and saying the words. And so, Kurum, part of all of this, part of building a book of business from scratch and not getting a return phone call is understanding that you are not, you're not on top of everybody's mind. That's okay. And that is part of being, humbled and then having humility. And I don't think any of us can be effective leaders or effective anything if we don't have humility as part of our daily, as part of our makeup, as part of our DNA.
Was it hard to access? I mean, so you definitely had those hard experiences, growing up. You built a practice before you worked in government. So you've done those hard things, but was there some sense in you of, at any point, this was like, look, I did hard things, and I was scrappy and worked hard and I was resourceful, and that's what got me to here being, U.S. attorney, accomplishing all the things you've accomplished along the way to get there. Was there a sense of like, why should I have to work hard again? Why should I have to be scrappy again? Why should I have to be rejected again? I've already done the hard stuff. That's what got me here. I've got a standard that I'm accustomed to of earned attention. Like, was there any of that in the transition?
Nope. That I can tell you. No, never felt that. And I don't feel that way now. And I think it's because I've never believed that I'm entitled to a damn thing, and I'm not. And the one thing about being an American, not an immigrant, an American, the true nature of this country, the one thing that makes this, I think, the greatest nation in the history of mankind, again, whatever you think of the current political situation, is because those who come to this country, or those who are raised and born here, all believe that at some point in their lives that they can accomplish anything, but they got to get it. They got to strive for it. It's, I think, the ethos of the United States. It's the ethos of who we are, where we live. So no, I mean, I knew when I left that I was going to get rejected by some folks. And do I believe being the former U.S. attorney might open some doors? Yes, absolutely. But I never expected that any door would open because I was a former U.S. I knew that I had to open that door myself. And I still feel that way. And I'll probably always feel that way. And it's the one thing I try to instill in my children as much as I can, is that, nothing is ever going to be given to you. You have to earn it, you have to get it. And so it's, yeah. So, yeah, that's the one thing I'm probably as much as, I've never been as firm and sure about something as that.
Right now, at this phase, you're in a building phase. And so when you're in a building phase, I imagine some structure helps you, for some structure how you approach your work week.
Yeah.
Making sure that, you're keeping, I know you're an avid swimmer. So, I imagine there's a certain amount of structure you're building in to iterate and get reps in as you hone your practice. So can you talk to me about how the structure is there structure you've self-imposed, and how is that helping you resolve anxieties or resolve the open-ended nature of this phase of your career?
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, there's always anxieties with building a practice. Anxieties from expectations that you set for yourself that others set for you, whether it was in my prior career or whether it's in this current career. And so what I've always been doing for the past, at least for the past 15 years or 16 years, is I'm somebody who's religiously always exercising. So before I was a marathoner, and I got injured, and then I became a person who just who swims with a master's group every morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. I was there this morning at 5 o'clock with my master's group. Um, doing a bunch of 50s and 100s and IMs and interspersed with with the dad jokes, which I know kill the best. For example, why did I get rid of my person who mows my lawn? Because Kurum, he wasn't cutting it. I mean, these are the gems I give every morning. You didn't even get my joke. Look at you. You can cut that from this podcast if you want. But, part of that is of course my routine. And one thing when I was in law school, I was not healthy about like taking care of my body and taking care of myself. People will often ask me, what's some piece of advice law students will ask me? I said, one thing you got to do is take care of your body and be healthy in law school. I think if I'd known that would have been great. I wasn't. And so that took a little bit later in life. So that's a big part of my routine is that. The other part is, I am present for my family. That's incredibly important as far as as part of my daily routine. It's always, and something, one of the gifts of being in the department was you didn't get paid a lot of money, but you could be, I thought I was a much better father, and husband because I was at the department and because they gave me that freedom. So that's another part of it. But then also it's and this is something I'm developing, is constantly working my list of contacts, my list of my network, building my network, doing all the things we've talked about. Every day I get up and I see what's being pumped out from the department, from the president, from different issues, what I'm seeing, trying to predict. Take, for example, the war in Iran. How does that manifest into issues in Houston? How does that manifest into issues in the oil and gas industry? How does that manifest, into issues geographically where I'm at? And so I'm constantly thinking about that. One of the things, and so I'm looking at that as well. One thing I'd like to be better at is really having a daily routine on that score. I've just added into my routine every Thursday. I'm going to reach out to a part of my network and just and check up on that and make sure I keep that connection. It means going to different offices in Washington, New York, Dallas, and Austin, and making sure I not only, of course, network from outside, but also network from within, and doing that and building those friendships and those relationships. Some of the best pieces of work I've had over the past year or so has been from partners within the firm who have been kind enough to give me work and to draw upon my expertise and allow me to counsel their clients. And that takes a lot of trust for a partner within the firm to say, you know what, I want you to do this piece of work for me, be a part of my team, and also I want you to be client-facing for me. That's important. That tells you they have a lot of trust in you. You got to build that trust. You got to build that friendship. You got to build that relationship. The great thing about Bracewell, one of the reasons I joined the firm, it's a big reason why I joined the firm, is I saw in the leadership in this firm the same leadership I had when I ran the Southern District of Texas. I talked about before with you in the prior podcast about the mama rule, how I believe that people should treat each other within the firm as they were their own mother. That same respect, that same sense of family. I get that here. And so, recently when I was in New York, I met with a partner and we spent 2 hours together just getting to know each other. It was incredibly impactful for me. I saw in him a version of myself, and that was great. And I have a new friend and constantly doing that. And so those are all the things I do every day to build that book of business. And it is every day. It is constant. And it's only, so it means taking care of myself, but also taking care of my relationships.
We talked about predictive counseling and the ways you're synthesizing these like completely different. You're looking at policy speeches, you're looking at Twitter accounts, you're really piecing it all together. You're looking at your own, experience and work that you've done and analyzing that. So you're synthesizing different sources to come up with predictions. I think for my final question for you, I'd like you to do some predictive counseling for Alamdar Hamdani. And so what do you see as, looking at yourself right now, what do you see for yourself in a year or so? Like, what do you think that you'll still be doing? What do you think will be different? Maybe, this is that diary you talked about. We can timestamp this and revisit this. You can set a calendar a year from now to see how this prediction borne out, but do a little predictive counseling for Alamdar for what's coming in your practice a year from now.
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I think a year from now or 2 years from now, the one thing I think an overriding thing that I'll still be doing, which is I'll still be hustling. I don't think it's just been part of my upbringing is that idea of the hustle. From 13 years old, to 54 years old. It's just part of my DNA. And so I think I'll still be doing that. I know I'll still be doing it. So when we talk in a couple of years, I'll still be hustling. I believe I'll still be, really making sure I take care of myself, internally, right? As both, athletically, body-wise, spiritually. That's also a big part of, that's important as well. I will also be doing predictive analysis constantly. It's what I did at the department. It's what I do now. It's what I think is what I enjoy doing is the constant predictive analysis. So if I'm doing all those things, I'm hoping my book of business is growing. So I hope a few years from now, of course, that book of business is much larger, much more constant, and will be one that benefits Bracewell, benefits me, benefits my family. Those are, I think, if I were to look down the road, I'm hopeful that's the case. I think along the way, I'm hopeful I will have some new arrows in my quiver. Is that right? Quiver of arrows. Along the way, I don't know what those arrows will look like. I assume the technology will be different a couple of years from now, and I'm hopeful that I am constantly upgrading my skills in the world of technology. And so, and finally, I'm hopeful that my network is larger and one that is constantly growing. I think, one thing I don't want to do is have a stagnant network. It's one that's hopefully growing and beneficial along the way. So I've had villages take care of me all along the way, and I'm going to need that village to constantly take care of me and for me to take care of them.
Okay, bonus question then.
Yeah.
You mentioned what's different about your practice than other practices. So then what role does network have? You mentioned network a few times. There's something different about a network-driven approach to practice as opposed to something else, maybe just focusing on the substance and just analysis and that kind of stuff. Like I feel like I want to hear about like network as opposed to what, and what is that is different about your approach that another peer with comparable experience would take a different path.
Yeah. So, I think this, as I sit here and think of, the different kinds of partners, for example, let's like that. There are those who build, who make ring. There are those who are really just thought leaders and smart in what they do. There are those who are service partners, and you can be all three. I'm hopeful I'll be all three. But each one of those has a network. So I think, Khurram, I don't think any of us doesn't have a network. We all have a network. I think whether you are just a service partner and all you do is service other partners, that's a network you rely on. And so I guess I can't see any, not only lawyers, but humans not having networks. And so I guess the point is none of us doesn't have a network. We all have a network. And so maybe the question is, do you tap into your network? And I tap into mine. Do you want to grow your network? I want to grow mine. And so maybe that's the real question. And so what I mean network means all my relationships that I have, and and building that and deepening those, but also kind of widening.
All right. Well, I'm sure we can keep going, but I think that's a lot of food for thought. So I think we've got a good timestamp right now to revisit a year or two from now to see how your predictions have borne out and what about your practice remains the same or what's changed. But so Alamdar, thanks for sharing about this stage of your career. It's not often that you get to talk to a U.S. attorney who is, returned to private practice and building that. And so to get an understanding of the things you're thinking about this stage, it's special. And I appreciate you taking the time to do that.
Thank you, Khurram. No, it's always a joy, and it's always special to talk to you, my friend. I really do enjoy our conversations, whether it's on a podcast or whether it's just you and I on a phone call. You are not only, of course, I think a good podcaster, I think I know you are developing into a good friend. So I appreciate it.